greatest irony in my life is that I graduated top of my class in film school, and yet my most successful creative endeavor has never involved a camera. From about 2019, I've been producing an alternate history podcast called the Twilight Histories, and alongside our head producer Jordan and a very talented team of creators, we've managed to produce a show that's been listened to over 2 million times. In fact, there was a time when our humble little podcast was so popular that we damn near caught up to Dan Carlin on the iTunes top charts. And trust me, if you know who that is, that was no mean feat. So as I'm starting out on this new creative endeavor here on YouTube, I wanted to share how I got started on my most successful creative endeavor and maybe talk a little bit about my creative process. So you might be wondering what would possess someone to spend more than half a decade writing alternative historical fiction and, reading it into a microphone. Sometimes I wonder that myself. But the answer is pretty straightforward. I just find that the past is cooler than the present. From about 2011, I was very interested in history. I was studying art history specifically as part of my degree, and I was particularly fascinated with classical and Renaissance art. And basically it all started with me wanting to know who all these people carved in marble were and who all these people painted in egg tempera were. And, I started slow. I was reading Greek and Roman classics, and not long after I started reading about the Middle Ages, and then the Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment. Basically, I read about everything up until about World War I, and I was just filling up my bookshelves with goodies that I found at B&B Books. And, when I couldn't read, like if I was on a particularly packed bus, I started listening to nonfiction history podcasts, with Mike Duncan's History of Rome being a gateway drug, so to speak. And I really came to admire the historical figures that I was learning about. Reading Vasari's lives got me very interested in the great figures of the Renaissance and contributed to my interest in the arts. And there were plenty of fascinating figures in the annals of Roman history too. No matter what I read though, I found that the lives of these people were just absolutely fascinating. And I wished that I could conjure up their bones and flesh and take them for a nice glass of Lachauffeur at my favorite pub. Basically, these were the people I wished were my friends. And I think above all, Giacomo Casanova and Napoleon Bonaparte were the ones who really inspired me and left a lasting impression on me when I read about them. My family has an interesting connection to Casanova that I'll save maybe for another video, but as far as Napoleon goes, it's really just about admiring somebody who came from basically nothing and transformed the entire world around him. Literally bent it to his will. And listen, I am a proud Italian, but when I was reading about Napoleon, I very, very badly wanted to be French. My Napoleon phase actually lasted for quite a while, and when I was visiting Paris with a friend in 2014, I went out of my way to visit Les Invalides and then proceeded to kneel down and weep in front of the tomb of Napoleon when I got there. Basically, I was very inspired at the time. I was in love with history, but graduating from film school in Toronto kind of dashes your dreams of writing and producing historical epics and, going down to LA and schlepping it as a barista until I got, scouted, just didn't really seem like the thing for me. Luckily, podcasting as a medium was really coming into its own and people were experimenting with the medium quite a bit. So I actually happened to stumble upon the perfect prototype for what I was looking to do in this cute little show called the Twilight Histories. And, after listening to a couple of the episodes and falling in love with the show, I was basically thinking, yeah, this is it. So I fired off an email to the only contact deets that were listed on iTunes back then, and the producer Jordan got back to me right away and was kind enough to give me some pointers. And I immediately ran with those and created my own podcast. I did roughly 3 episodes of my own show called Voices from the Ages, featuring stories from Angevin France, Kassite Babylon, and 18th century Vienna. They weren't perfect, but they were spirited, filled with very high drama, insane characters, all of whom were voiced by me in some totally cringeworthy accents. But once the show got listed on iTunes, people loved it, and they were writing and begging me to cover different eras of history. So, win. But before I could get too deep into my own show, I noticed a new email from Jordan at the Twilight Histories, and the gist of it was, hey, your show turned out pretty good. Would you want to come and produce for mine? Seeing a good opportunity, I didn't hesitate to say yes. And 5 years and nearly 40 shows later, I don't regret my decision. So what exactly is the Twilight Histories? Well, the blurb from our website says it best. You are a time traveler sent to strange and exotic lands. You will explore Egypt ravaged by an ice age, a Carthaginian colony on Mars, a resurgent Aztec empire, and many other strange and exciting alternate histories. So step into your time machine, if you dare. What sets us apart from most fiction podcasts is that the stories that we tell are actually in the first-person perspective. You are the protagonist, experiencing the story in real time. We even recommend that you turn the lights off and/or close your eyes when listening to the show, because we really want it to feel like you're almost in a lucid dream, exploring a real world filled with nothing but possibility. But that experience doesn't happen by accident. We put a lot of work into creating something that basically turns your earbuds into a VR headset. And I think it's fair to say that the number one priority whenever we're creating an episode is to avoid breaking immersion. No matter how far out and alternative the history we're exploring can get sometimes. And I think if I had to boil it down, there are basically 4 steps that we use to create these very immersive stories: research, writing, narration, and sound design. The research phase is basically my favorite part in making any podcast. I like to read, and like a lot of people, I also love mellowing out to a good documentary or podcast as well. But generally speaking, I like to make a trip to the bookstore or the library to really get the ball rolling. I like to read at least 2 to 3 books whenever I have an inkling about which time period I'm going to cover. And I try to stick mostly to writers with good academic credentials, but sometimes I will pick up something from a little more out of left field, because the interesting thing about history is that it's not actually set in stone. Often our assumptions are challenged and we realize that the past is more complicated than we initially realized. And sometimes the ambiguities in history are the perfect breeding ground for stories. In any case, I'll read as much as I can and then prepare a pretty detailed set of notes. And these notes will allow me to start roughing out a story beat or 2 later on and give me material that I can use in world building. And I try to note just about everything relevant to a given time period: religion, political structure, geography, cuisine, music, and fashion, among others. If you listen to just about any Twilight Histories episode, one thing that we do in almost every show is actually walk the listener through a market or a town square fairly early on in the story, mostly to introduce a lot of these contextual pieces and help flesh out the world a little bit more. That scene is actually so critical in creating immersion, and you can't even begin to create it without having done your research, right? And so basically, when I've let the research and source material sink in well enough, that's when I can actually take the time to sit down and, write the thing. Eventually, I do sit down with my notes, I pull them up, and basically, when I'm trying to figure out how to carve a story out of the mountain of research notes that I have, I generally speaking start with one question. If I could time travel to that place in time, what would I want to do? Sometimes the answer is pretty straightforward, like seeing the pyramids being built or joining Richard the Lionheart on crusade. But other times I need to go back to my notes about the environment or social circumstances, and maybe a story emerges out of that. Let's take 16th century Spain for an example. It might not immediately jump out at you as a fascinating place to tell a story, but the Spanish Inquisition, for example, could offer plenty of opportunities to craft a compelling drama if nothing too crazy was happening in the political or military scene. In any case, at that point, I usually like to rough out an outline. I typically just start with a few bullet points. I find that those do the trick, and I usually like to write the beginning and the ending first, because it helps to provide a firm structure for the middle of the story to kind of bridge through. Conventional wisdom, I think, is that as long as you know where you're going, you'll get there eventually. In terms of drafts, I typically rewrite my pieces twice. The first draft is always abysmal, and the second draft is only marginally better. The real magic happens when I read the second draft out loud and begin to understand how it actually sounds. Because podcasts are anchored in dialogue, I have to make sure that it flows really well, especially if there's dialogue between characters. You would actually be surprised how many nice turns of phrase sound absolutely stupid when they're said out loud. So once that's done and I've given it one last read through, I basically have my script, and then I can sit down in the studio to go about the dirty business of recording. Recording is definitely my least favorite of the steps involved in podcast production, But of course, you can't have a narrative podcast without recording your voice, so my priority is basically to make this process as smooth as possible. And back when I started recording my own show, the process was especially brutal. To get passable audio, I would basically have to snuggle up in my closet with this little Zoom H1 and a wired lav mic. I would literally print out my scripts, turn on a flashlight, and then basically read into the dark. Fast forward a little bit, and I upgraded to a very cool Tascam field recorder because I was trying to get some other gigs at the time, including some work on short films, and the unit, was good enough to do double duty. But I was still recording in the closet until I finally bought some soundproof foam and then got myself this very nice mic that you're looking at right now. My last and most recent upgrade was finally getting a decent desktop mixer recorder. The Rodecaster Pro was my go-to in this case, and it has not disappointed. More than anything, having a permanent setup where I can just sit down and literally hit record really smooths out the process. Although I will say that the gear itself isn't too important. Really, all you need to do is get decent levels while avoiding too much reverb and background noise, because, you can basically deal with a little, but not that much in post. And of course, you want to make sure that your setup is comfortable so that you don't, tucker yourself out when you're recording. Reading the script is also a little bit easier because now I have a gigantic monitor and the Apple Magic Mouse is fantastic at silently scrolling so that I can just, advance the script. And generally, I tackled the recording in about a day, so I can keep the voices of my characters and my general energy levels consistent. Usually, I'll break things up into chapters with 10-minute breaks between them, just to, keep my voice relatively soothed. I only record each chapter once, usually, and if I mess up, I just go back to the start of a paragraph or somewhere that makes sense. I wait for a few seconds and then I'll snap to signal to myself in the edit that the upcoming section was botched, and then I can just start reading again. I rarely have to start a whole chapter over unless I'm literally botching every other line. But basically I have to do this because it's just not feasible to record 60 minutes of audio over and over and over again with the limited amount of time and, breath that I have. All in all, it's usually 3-ish hours of recording if things go smoothly. And from there, we can finally get to post-production. So editing tends to be another slog, but at least it's a creative slog. The biggest hurdle at this point usually is getting the audio from your recording session, laying it all out, and then doing a little mixing right off the bat to make sure that it sounds better. Full disclosure, presets are your best friend. I use a lot for noise reduction, compression, and EQ as well, which all helps to get the bass recordings in good enough shape that I don't hate myself while I'm editing them. And I might adjust the volume across all the clips too, just to make sure that the dialogue is hitting the levels that I want from the outset. And from there, I'll just start listening to the audio, cutting out any mistakes that I come across, any dead air, or of course, any bad takes. And then I try to roughly pace out how I'd like the story to flow. From there, I usually like to grab some temp music and lay it in so I can push around the narration a little bit more and get closer to the final runtime and again, flow of the story. And if I really like the temp music, I keep it. Simple as. And from there, we get to the hardest part of the process, which is sound design proper. In order to get these really immersive worlds, we rely a lot on sound effects and atmospheres. Everything from wind blowing to doors opening to crowds chattering in a particular language. And I'll lay in just about as many as I need for each scene to create a really fleshed out backdrop, and then we'll follow that up with specific sound effects like the discharge of a musket or the clashing of swords. The sound effects that basically really punctuate the narrative. And finding the right sound effects can actually take quite a bit of time. Over the years, I've done everything from use a sound effect library that I carried around on a gigantic hard drive to using digital subscription services. But to be honest, no matter what resource you use, it just takes a really long time to find what you need, especially if your story is set in the pre-modern era. Anyway, once all the sound effects and music are finalized and everything is timed pretty properly, I get down to mixing proper. And at this point, I am basically just trying to balance the strengths of the tracks against each other with the goal of always making sure that the dialogue is intelligible and is obviously the focus of what's going on. And from there, I can go back and fix little trouble spots like peaks in the audio or other little mistakes that may have wormed their way into the recording. Usually, I'll need to listen to the whole thing over at least 2 or 3 times, at least once on a speaker, and then again, in headphones to make sure that it sounds good wherever it plays. And once that's all done, I can export the mix, send it off to Jordan, and then fix myself a strong drink to unwind. At the end of the day, every podcast is a labor of love. For me, it's a great way to experience the world that was, the world that never was, and the world that could have been. And the creative freedom that I have in producing these shows is absolutely unrivaled. And I think that it reflects in the work that I put out. And it's not just me. The stories that Jordan and my fellow producers put out are just wild. And I mean, not to glaze this too much, but there is some absolutely fantastic fodder for TV or the movies there. But maybe it is better this way, that we're confined just to audio. The fact that anyone can be the protagonist of a Twilight Histories story and that your own imagination does the heavy lifting, well, I think maybe that's where the real magic is.